welcome back to Beyond the Books, where we go, well, beyond the books in the School of Literatures, Languages and Cultures in the University of Edinburgh, otherwise known as LLC. My name is Beth Price and I'm a PhD researcher as well as the LLC Communications Postgraduate Intern. That means that as well as working on my thesis, I get the opportunity to sit down with the other researchers in LLC to find out what they're working on, how they got here, and how important the humanities are for our world. Today I'm joined by Paul Crosthwaite, Professor of Modern and Contemporary Literature in the English Literature Department. Working in what's called the Economic Humanities, Paul's research explores speculative fiction, which covers everything from literary fiction to science fiction, more commonly known as SF, and even self-help guides. And he asks whether fiction can really predict the next economic trend. Paul, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks very much for having me, Beth.
So to start off, please just tell me about your academic journey so far.
I won't give you the full chapter and verse back to primary school, but let's say I finished my PhD at Newcastle University in 2007 and was lucky enough relatively soon after that to be appointed to what was initially a temporary but subsequently became a permanent post at Cardiff University, which at that time, and still to a significant degree, was a real kind of hotbed of cultural theory. I stayed there for 4 years and then came to the University of Edinburgh in 2011 as a lecturer initially, and I was subsequently promoted to senior lecturer and a couple of years ago to professor.
Please can you sum up your research that you're doing at the moment and maybe a little bit of context as to how you got there?
So the research that I am doing currently and have been doing for the past, 15 years or so, is in this broad field of what's increasingly referred to as the economic humanities. And in the most basic terms, that is a field which kind of, by turns, emphasizes one side of that equation or the other. So sometimes it's about looking at humanities objects of study, literature in my case, through an economic lens. How does reading a novel, for example, from an economic point of view, help us to understand that novel better? But also it can be in a kind of reverse polarity where you take the tools of the humanities, the kind of close reading techniques of literary studies, for example, and train those on, say, economic theory or even economic reality, economic practice, and say, okay, how might we use a humanities analytical methodological toolkit to better understand the economy? Edinburgh is a really interesting place to be doing this kind of work. It's an interesting place to be doing it because you could make a strong case, and I would make the case, that the University of Edinburgh is actually the cradle of something like the economic humanities, in the sense that it was central to the Scottish Enlightenment, and a figure like Adam Smith, whom we know most clearly as the founder of political economy, was also instrumental in establishing what we now think of as the discipline of English literature. He gave lectures in the field of rhetoric and belles-lettres at the universities of Edinburgh and also Glasgow. Many people see this as the kind of origins of the study of English literature as a discipline. You can trace that discipline to this 18th century Enlightenment moment in Scotland. A figure like Smith kind of embodies what I imagine the economic humanities to be, which is a sense that we could simultaneously be thinking about questions of language, genre, literary form, style, and so forth, as well as questions of economics, money, labour, finance, and so forth, that you can have a kind of interdisciplinary interface between these fields. And people like Mary Poovey, an American scholar, have made the case that what we've seen over the past several centuries is a kind of divergence really between two fields of inquiry, the literary, the economic, that were really indistinguishable in the 18th century. They've kind of parted ways gradually. Economics has become increasingly technical, mathematical, and so forth. But I suppose the ultimate kind of dream of something like the economic humanities is not just forging a connection between these fields, but reforging a connection that was there at the start, so to speak. I mentioned Edinburgh as symbolically a sort of fitting place to be doing this kind of work, but it's not just a matter of a sort of 18th century heritage, which might be nice to think that this is the place where this kind of thinking first took hold, but you can't really sustain a present day intellectual topic on, in fact, Adam Smith used to lecture here hundreds of years ago. Another thing that makes Edinburgh really conducive and encouraging and vibrant for this kind of work is that colleagues in the social sciences have also been doing really exciting work, which is social scientific in nature, but certainly has a way of approaching its questions, which I think are accessible and recognizable to people working in the humanities. So, for example, I'm thinking of the work in the social studies of finance that has been pioneered by Donald Mackenzie in the School of Social and Political Science here at Edinburgh, which has really pioneered the performativity account of economics, which is essentially the claim that the things that people say about the economy can actually shape the economy itself. So a kind of classic example that someone like Mackenzie would give is that someone develops a theory, a model, a hypothesis about how financial markets work or should work. And if that theory is kind of sufficiently widely accepted and taken up and built into the way in which traders in financial markets actually practice, there's an extent to which the reality will come to fit the theory, not necessarily because the theory is objectively true or correct or right, but because the theory has, as it were, made itself true. So it's performatively brought about the very reality that it claims to merely neutrally be describing. This is a kind of idea that I think is very kind of prevalent and powerful in humanities disciplines. It turns out that a similar kind of thinking about the power of language, essentially power of rhetoric, power of speech, discourse, is prevalent in the social sciences as well, particularly pioneered here at Edinburgh. So being part of that wider community of thought and research has been really encouraging for my work as well.
Everyone directly feels the impact of the economy. It's something that is very real, but also isn't quite real. You're saying it's not this objective theory based on observation. It's, well, we think it's like this and we're going to say it's like that. And then that actually happens.
Yeah, exactly. And I guess this is a factor of every kind of social science as such. The social scientist is always studying a phenomenon which is liable to become aware of the terms in which it's being studied and the things that are being said about it, and to incorporate that study into the way in which it behaves. So you have this kind of interplay between the scientific claims that are made about the social world and the ways in which people actually act within the social world, which may in some ways reflect what social science says, but also might deliberately contradict it in certain ways as well. So I think there's always a degree to which social scientific accounts of the world are liable to interact with how the world actually operates in strange ways, which is one of the things that makes it different to the natural sciences or the physical sciences, but also one of the things that makes it intellectually really exciting to someone like me.
When you're looking at literature that's responding to economic change, economic crises, how much of that is reflective? So it's like this thing has happened in the economy and then authors are responding to that. And how much of that is, if economists can say, we think it works like this, and then it starts to work like that, how much of the literature that you look at is potentially kind of causing that?
It's always difficult, I think, to kind of make the claim that literature makes things happen in a kind of obvious or direct way. Certainly, I think often writers about economics, finance, etc., are imagining or hoping that their work might have some kind of salutary function. It might warn people about the direction of travel. It might kind of sound an alarm in some way. One form of literature that I have studied, which you would have to understand as literature only in quite a loose sense, is the genre of writing which is geared towards giving ordinary members of the public advice about how to invest in the stock market. Now, this is a very extensive genre, and along with a team of colleagues, I studied its kind of development over a number of centuries. I think it could be argued that in particular periods, the prevalence of this kind of writing, how popular it was, how influential it was, did have a demonstrable effect on the economic world itself. So, for example, I'm particularly interested in several projects that I've done in the run-up to the great crash, the Wall Street crash of 1929. There was an absolute flurry of writing in this period, encouraging the ordinary American worker to get into the stock market while prices were skyrocketing. It does seem to be the case that certain particularly popular and influential guidebooks to the stock market did affect the way in which, en masse, the American public was investing in that period. For example, a book which encouraged ordinary Americans to move out of bonds, which traditionally were seen as the more conservative, safer option, and into stocks. This was a shift that was seen during the period. There's clearly a correlation there, and some people would certainly claim that there was causality as well, that the prevalence of this argument being made in a particular book, but also in the wider press and media, actually led people to shift their economic behavior in this way, arguably in ways which actually helped to fuel the boom, which eventually led to the bust, the crash. So that would be an example of literature in the loose sense of a particular kind of genre of writing having this influential effect on the economic reality. But obviously that's slightly different to poems or plays or works of fiction. But nevertheless, it is that interplay between writing and economic reality is something I'm really interested in.
Then another question for the transition, I guess, from going English literature to economic humanities. How much economics did you need to learn?
I always try to stress to people I'm having these conversations with that I'm not a trained economist, and I would make no claims to be. I've tried, I suppose, to go about this in a sort of autodidactic way, to read a lot of economic research itself, but also histories of economic thought, work in fields like economic sociology, the social studies of finance, cultural economy, these branches of the social sciences, which think about economic questions but see themselves as distinct from economics. So I would like to think that I am reasonably well informed in the field and able to talk with a degree of confidence about these topics and write about them with a degree of confidence. But I would not claim to be properly trained in the field. And I always try to approach it with the sort of humbleness that someone in that position should have.
From everything that you've looked at and from the kind of patterns that you've seen, do you think that the economic humanities can be used to look forward?
This is one of the areas in which literature has the potential to have a kind of meaningful or even transformative effect on the economic world itself, in the way that it conducts sort of often extended thought experiments. So I suppose I'm particularly thinking about forms of speculative fiction, science fiction, work in these genres which are all about offering us a kind of refracted, distorted, reconfigured version of our world to conceive of how that world might be different, either in a kind of alternate reality or in some far future or even some remote past sometimes. So trying to kind of defamiliarize the kind of entrenched, naturalized assumptions of our social world by offering a world which in some ways resembles it, but in some ways is radically different. One of the interesting things about a lot of writing in those genres is the extent to which it's interested in alternate forms of economic organization. My friend Joe Walton, for example, has written a lot about the different kinds of money that appear in SF. Virtually every SF text or film, even if it might seem to be an incidental detail in world building, will have a kind of money. And usually they're called credits. And they're not particularly interesting. But it might be money based in energy, or money based in thought, or money based in community, or money based in magic. So that it's a way of imagining how money could take a different form, be organized in a different way, perhaps be distributed in different ways or created in different ways. And these kinds of speculative genres are really good at just prompting us to ask those kind of what if questions. So there's a version of a kind of economic humanities work, I think, which would be about using the resources of imaginative literature, speculative SF, or potentially more realist as well, as a kind of toolbox for thinking about, okay, what might be kind of radically imaginative, but also in certain ways kind of viable or feasible ways in which economic reality could be reconceived, and how might they then be kind of implemented? What kind of practical measures might they imply? So I think there's huge potential in that kind of conjunction of the sort of ultra imaginative and also the kind of pragmatic and practical. It feels to me there is a way in which those two things could meet up in productive ways.
And when you're talking about literature, what counts as literature? Where does it stop being literature and it start being something else for your purposes?
Both for theoretical, intellectual, conceptual reasons, but also for kind of pragmatic reasons, I'm inclined to view the category of literature as quite a loose and capacious, deliberately kind of vague or baggy one. I mean, from a theoretical point of view, I'm sort of persuaded by the sort of 1980s cultural studies critique of literature with a capital L, and the idea that it is this somehow pristine, distinct, removed, autonomous, ennobled realm that is somehow detached from the kind of grubbiness of other ways in which language is used in everyday interactions and so forth. It feels to me that what we call literature is embedded in all of those interactions in all kinds of ways. I don't think I would want to do away with the idea of literature completely. I sometimes say that I think of it as literature with half a capital L. There could be such a thing. But I guess I tend to prefer to think in terms of something like imaginative writing, or even imaginative narrative, imaginative representation broadly, ways of writing which aren't just purely about kind of information delivery, ways of writing that in some way are sort of shot through with narrative features, rhetorical features, ways of the author articulating themselves which aren't simply reducible to the most kind of efficient direct transmission of content. Which is why I don't feel too uncomfortable about referring to things like investment advice manuals as literature. Because when you read these kinds of books, they're actually often wildly inventive, imaginative, if not outright bizarre flights of fancy.
Which I think kind of leads on to your book, Speculative Time. And am I right in saying that that is looking more at what might be literature with a capital L?
Yes. Having said all that, you're quite right that, my most recent book is, I guess, more conventionally a work of literary criticism, literary history, in the sense that its central objects of study are primarily novels, but also drama, theatre, and also quite a lot of visual art as well, fine art, but also journalistic photography as well. But yes, it's kind of its core archive is literary or artistic in a more conventional or narrower sense. Although I do also historicize that kind of literary archive alongside a vast abundance of newspaper reporting or economic theory from the period and so on. And so again, it's sort of blurring the distinctions between the literary and the non-literary. But you're right, it's focusing on a literary topic. I think the kind of the sort of genesis of the project, though, was a question that had sort of nagged at me for a long time and intrigued me, which in the most kind of basic terms, you could be summed up in a claim that is often made about F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby, which is published in 1925. It's the great American novel. It's rightly, vastly acclaimed. And one of the things that's often said about it, often with a kind of almost casual feel, as if this kind of goes without saying or can be taken for granted, is that it predicted the great crash of 1929, which we were talking about a moment ago. When Baz Luhrmann was making his adaptation of Gatsby with Leonardo DiCaprio, it was shortly after the global financial crisis of 2007 to 2008. And he was saying, this story feels very current in our moment. And it was also a text which more or less predicted, prophesied the crisis of its own era that kind of brought the Roaring Twenties, the Jazz Age, to its end. And a question that kind of intrigued me was, what would it mean for that to be true? What would it mean for a work of literature, a novel that's published 4 years before the event that it's ostensibly about, to in fact be about that thing? What would it mean for a text to take as its reference something which hasn't yet happened. And so that was a kind of question that intrigued me and I reflected on in different ways. And then that expanded into a broader project thinking about 1929, the wider sort of culture and climate and atmosphere of wild speculative excess that surrounded that crisis moment, and the questions of time, temporality, history, anticipation, prediction that were kind of turbocharged by that atmosphere, that kind of cultural condition. And that filled out the full scope of a book, but it really came from a sort of puzzlement about a claim which was casually made, but seemed on some level to seem impossible. Was there a way in which it could be true?
So the book doesn't just focus on F. Scott Fitzgerald. You look at a whole range of authors from all these different demographics and responding to the crisis or speculating about what was the 1929 crash in very different ways. How did you pick the materials that you were going to work with?
Yeah, there is an abundance of material, and there were some key figures whom it seemed crucial to include. Fitzgerald, as I've mentioned, John Dos Passos, who has another important novel from 1925, Manhattan Transfer, but whose USA trilogy also reflects on the kind of climate that ran up to the crash as well. One of the key things I wanted to do in the project was think about this concept of speculation very broadly, so that it figures in the book as something that kind of emanates from Wall Street or LaSalle Street in Chicago, where the Chicago Board of Trade was based. How this kind of speculative atmosphere emanates from these very iconic, grand locations, but actually permeates the culture more generally. And one of the really interesting areas that it permeates and is kind of taken up and reimagined was in African-American communities, particularly in New York, in Harlem, and in what's called Bronzeville on the south side of Chicago. People in these communities were fascinated by the phenomenon of speculation and developed their own modes of it, particularly through this form of lottery gambling called the numbers game policy. And this was a huge cultural phenomenon in particularly African-American communities, though by no means exclusively, in the early decades of the 20th century. And one of the interesting things about it is that it was very much modeled on the culture and the trappings of Wall Street and LaSalle Street. So the numbers that were the winning numbers for the gambling process were often taken from the final totals on Wall Street or on one of the nation's other financial hubs. The whole iconography of the game was trading on the sort of mystique or the glamour of Wall Street. But it was also a kind of parodic critique of Wall Street as well, because the claim that would be made by a speculator on Wall Street was that they were making these very calculated, very considered, very informed moves in the market, which demonstrated their kind of sophistication, whereas someone playing the numbers game was just gambling. But the implication of the numbers game and the way in which it's presented itself as a kind of version of the stock market would be that, well, isn't the stock market just a form of gambling as well? Which in many ways it is, and in many ways it was. So it turned the tables in a sense, on the very world that it also in some ways reflected and drew a certain kind of glamour or prestige or appeal. So I was interested in African-American writers, Claude McKay, Richard Wright, Ralph Ellison in particular, who write novels that center around the numbers game and use the numbers game as a kind of metaphor for different forms of kind of political speculation. So, for example, they think about the appeal of communism or the power of fascist movements globally, but also domestically in the period, about the power of a Pan-African imagination in terms of gambling or speculation, and use metaphors from the numbers game to either celebrate these movements or to critique them, to present them as these kind of disastrous forms of speculation that will only result in crisis and catastrophe.
The 1929 crash was probably most acute in America, at least the beginnings of it. The impact was global, but Wall Street and the culture around it and the Great Depression and the Dust Bowl and all the things that span off of it is particularly American. Is the literature then particularly American. Would you see any of the same sort of speculation happening in European literature and British literature?
One interesting text that I write about in the book is a novel by the Australian writer Christina Stead called House of All Nations, which is set in a private bank in Paris in the aftermath of the Great Crash, and is about how the Wall Street crash created this ultimately global crisis, fueled the Great Depression in ways which then had, politically at least, far more catastrophic consequences in Europe than they had in the United States. Most obviously, of course, the rise of fascism. So that's a novel which kind of traces events on Wall Street to events in Paris and events in Berlin and events really across the entire European continent. So that offers an interesting alternate perspective on this, what's otherwise quite a kind of US-centric narrative. I mean, another parallel that I would draw is with a slightly earlier moment of crisis, and one which has a sort of national particularity, which is the Weimar hyperinflation in Germany in the 1920s. One of the kind of cultural implications of that moment of crisis in which the value of money almost sort of evaporates, people carrying around wheelbarrows full of marks and so forth, children being given blocks of money to play with, people wallpapering their walls with banknotes because they're so worthless. And one of the kind of cultural correlates to this is the rise of German expressionism, this form of art, but also literature and particularly film, in which the world is grotesquely, outrageously, extravagantly distorted, made strange. Angles are weirdly irregular. Nothing quite seems to have the proportions or the form or the ordered, rational arrangement that it should. So expressionism in Germany can be at least partially explained by this kind of catastrophe and this crisis of value, where everything seems to be becoming wildly distorted and out of kilter. Interestingly, in the aftermath of the Great Crash in the US, there's a kind of boom in expressionist theatre as well. And I write about a play written by the poet Archibald MacLeish called Panic, which was staged in a kind of hyper-expressionist manner, very stylized movements, this very kind of heightened, ornate, poetic diction that the characters enunciate in the play. Again, it's something about ordinary life being plunged into a sort of nightmarish, bizarre, phantasmagoric kind of space by the experience of economic crisis, so that everything feels warped and made unfamiliar by this state of disorder.
The slightly bleak question to go from that is your work, you're looking at the impact of the economy on culture and almost vice versa, the impact of culture on the economy. But it seems like the main force is really something happens in the economy and then creatively we respond to that, and it's a way of maybe processing what's happened. Does that mean that culture and art and literature and everything that we can kind of create, does that mean that it is entirely dictated by the economy?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, this is something that I grappled with in my previous book, which is called The Market Logics of Contemporary Fiction. And as that title suggests, I think, what that book is trying to think about is to what extent is contemporary fiction so shaped by the demands of huge multinational publishers with shareholders who need to be rewarded with profits and growth quarter after quarter. Do those market pressures, those demands to maximize sales, to maximize the performance of a work in the market, is that simply dictating what's produced and consequently making literature increasingly kind of formulaic or safe or conventional? And I guess to put it in the most kind of basic terms, the answer I come to is yes, to a degree. That, for example, people have talked quite a lot about the genre turn in contemporary Anglophone literature, fiction, that so-called kind of literary novelists are increasingly embracing genre forms like SF that we've been talking about, or fantasy, or the Gothic, or the Western, or whatever it might be. So you get these kinds of blendings of quote unquote literary fiction and these more kind of recognizable genre styles. And one kind of plausible explanation for that, which I endorse to a degree in the book, is that this is literary novelists recognizing the relative kind of lack of marketability of kind of literary fiction, however we define that, and recognizing the relative marketability of genre fiction, and hence it's a kind of calculated move. The other side of that, though, is a couple of things. Firstly, that there's still a lot of really daring, experimental, radical, exciting writing that's being produced. For another, there's also a market for that writing, and there's a degree to which a novel which succeeds in kind of reinventing what the novel can do might not be an obvious sales proposition, but if it creates its own taste, it creates its own market, if you like, then it can end up being marketable. So literary experimentation and marketability aren't necessarily at odds, even though in practice they often are. One of the things I think is really interesting is the extent to which that predicament is actually internalized within contemporary fiction itself. So giving rise to this phenomenon that I call market metafiction. So metafiction is basically fiction which is about fiction. So it's your classic kind of work of metafiction is the novel in which halfway through a character with the name of the author appears and starts telling you about the narrative that they've been narrating and, reminds you that it's all just a story, it's all just words on a page, these characters aren't real, it's all made up. So metafiction kind of commenting on itself, drawing attention to itself. Market metafiction is this kind of subset of that mode in which what the writers are drawing attention to is the way in which the novel itself is both responding to, but also perhaps to some degree resisting the pressures of the market. So you'll get these kind of more or less explicit reflections within the text on the way in which the text itself is positioned in relation to the market. So an obvious example of this that some listeners might be familiar with would be Ben Lerner's novel 1004, which is all about the writing of the novel that we're now reading and the advance that Ben, the protagonist of the novel, has supposedly got from a big publisher, his wranglings with the New Yorker about whether he should cut a particular story or not, which then ends up within the novel itself. So it's this very self-conscious set of reflections on the marketability of the novel that we're reading. Progenitor of this would be Percival Everett's Erasure, which was adapted recently as American fiction. Erasure, I think, came out in 2000, but it really anticipates this mode. And one of the really kind of smart, shrewd things it does is what it reflects on centrally is the degree to which, in order to be marketable, African-American writers are expected to confine themselves to a rather narrow, stereotyped set of kind of tropes around sort of urban dysfunction or family breakdown, crime, in a way which is offensive and stereotypical and also extremely constraining for the sort of expressive possibilities of African-American literature. And Erasure kind of nails that in this bitingly satirical way. And it's interesting that similar kinds of questions around race, ethnicity, fiction, marketability, the publishing industry have really kind of come powerfully to the fore again in the past few years.
To speculate then, with the recent US elections and the sort of general lethargy of economic growth pretty globally at the moment, what do you think is going to happen with literature and fiction?
Dystopia seems a fair bet, doesn't it? You could probably put your money on dystopia. I mean, I read things about how 1984 and The Handmaid's Tale had seen these kind of many-fold increases in sales in the hours immediately after the election result. So yeah, I think it's probably a safe bet that there's going to be a proliferation of dystopian visions of America and of the world more generally. There are always dystopias and there are always reasons to feel dystopian. It feels like it might be a boom time for that. But perhaps for very similar reasons, it might be a boom period for utopian thinking as well. Certainly, I think those speculative modes are likely to be very prominent in the culture broadly over the coming years. And they will always, I think, have a kind of pessimistic undertow. But I suspect there's also going to be a lot of highly imaginative, highly kind of blue skies, utopian thinking as well, because I think the moment clearly calls for it.
Let's stick with utopian for the last question. Any closing advice for people in LLC doing research of any kind?
Well, I mean, the conditions in which we work and the conditions in which PhD students work are obviously hugely challenging in all kinds of ways. One of the things that I think we can find some reward and some excitement and value in is, of course, the work that we do and trying to communicate that work, trying to demonstrate the value of that work. And so I guess if I had a word of advice in that area for PhD students, and any of my own PhD students who might be listening will recognise this immediately, it would be about seeing the importance of trying to communicate the importance of one's research. And one of the kind of implications of that being the desirability of always trying to adopt a kind of generous relation to one's reader, trying to seek clarity, trying to seek lucidity, trying to take the reader on a journey through a piece of writing, to try to explain to a reader what they need to know, what they need to understand, to put in the building blocks that guide them from one point to another. And to do that, not just to infantilize the reader or treat them as if they can't work things out for themselves, but primarily because it's about underscoring why this matters. I think if you don't explain to a reader in the clearest possible terms why they should care, what's at stake, what the implications are, then it's quite possible that they won't intuit that for themselves. And I think we need to be doing everything in the most micro and macro ways at the moment to explain why the kind of work we do matters. And I think PhD students can do that in the work that they're doing by just thinking all the time in terms of, why is this interesting? Why is this exciting? Why do I want to convey this? Why do I think people will care? Why do I think this speaks to some question that excites me and preoccupies me? So if there's a word of advice that's of any kind of use or relevance, I think it would be that.
That's a really optimistic note to close on. Thank you so much. Thank you for listening to Beyond the Books. If you've enjoyed this, you can find all of our other episodes on Apple Podcasts. You can find us on YouTube at the University of Edinburgh LLC, or you can head to the website llc.ed.ac.uk/research/beyond-the-books. If you want to hear more from Paul, you can find his inaugural lecture, What Are the Economic Humanities? A Short Guide to an Interdisciplinary Field, through the website as well. Thank you once again for listening. I have been Beth Price, and this has been Beyond the Books.